Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of pure mechanical precision.
Right, like it's a math problem or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like you fall, you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at the film and says, well, there it is. That is the problem.
It is entirely binary. I mean, it's broken or it's not broken. You see the pathogen under the microscope or you don't.
Yeah.
We naturally gravitate toward that kind of clean categorization because it offers a very comforting sense of control.
But then, you step into the world of mental health, neurodevelopment, trauma, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just broken.
Completely.
We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, well, honestly, it's murky. It behaves much more like a weather system than a broken bone.
Oh, that's a really good way to put it.
And for a long time, we've tried to force that x-ray precision onto a storm front. Which brings us to why we're doing this deep dive today.
Right, the new paper.
Yeah, that friction is exactly why we're looking at a massive paradigm-shifting paper today from the Journal of Psychopathology and Clinical Science.
And it really is massive.
It is. It's authored by Avshalom, Caspi, Terrie E. Moffitt, and this large team of international researchers. And it essentially dismantles everything we thought we knew about how mental illness is categorized.
And studied and experienced over a human life, really. The sheer scale of what they've done here is phenomenal.
Yeah, they've synthesized millions of data points, right?
Millions. Across multiple countries, tracking entire generations to challenge a very, very entrenched medical dogma.
So the core concept we are zeroing in on today for you listening is something they call P.
The P factor.
Right. Not a specific disorder, but P, which is the general tendency of a person to develop a wide range of completely different mental disorders over a lifetime.
Which totally flips the script.
It does. We're going to look at why the traditional approach of studying one mental disorder at a time, putting depression in one silo and anxiety in another, is fundamentally flawed. Okay, let's unpack this.
To really grasp the gravity of the P factor, we have to look at the holy grail of psychopathology over the last few decades.
Right.
Because the entire field has been obsessively hunting for causal specificity.
Meaning looking for the specific trigger that causes the specific problem.
Exactly. Like, what is the single isolated genetic mutation that causes schizophrenia?
Or what's the exact microscopic alteration in the brain that causes ADHD?
Right. Or what specific type of childhood adversity guarantees you will develop severe depression later in life?
Just looking for that one-to-one mapping.
Yeah. Millions of dollars and decades of research have been poured into genome-wide association studies and advanced neuroimaging to find those isolated triggers. And the search has come up essentially empty.
Wow. So it's like we've been trying to find the one single broken wire that causes the radio to stop working, only to realize the entire electrical grid of the house is prone to power surges.
Yes. The electrical grid is a great lens for this. When geneticists look at the data now, they don't find a depression gene.
Oh, really?
No, they find that the genetic risks, the brain morphology alterations, the environmental vulnerabilities, they are overwhelmingly transdiagnostic.
Transdiagnostic,
Yeah.
meaning they cross over.
Exactly. The vulnerabilities in the grid don't care about the neat little labels we've created in our diagnostic manuals. The risks are shared across many different forms of psychopathology.
Okay, so fundamentally, most disorders are more similar than they are distinct. Like we've built an entire medical taxonomy assuming these things are discrete species, but they're really just different branches of the same tree.
Yes, the liability is generalized, and what's fascinating here is how the scientific community missed this shared vulnerability for so long.
Right, how do you miss that?
The blind spot comes down to how we traditionally collect data. Historically, researchers rely heavily on cross-sectional data.
Okay, so looking at a group of people at one single point in time, taking a snapshot.
But a snapshot entirely misses the movie. You miss the multi-generational picture, and you miss how these conditions morph over a single person's lifespan.
Which makes sense.
Right. If you only look at the weather at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, you have no idea what the climate actually is.
That brings us to how this research team broke out of the snapshot method. Because they didn't just look at individuals in isolation today.
No, they didn't.
They looked at entire family trees, which introduces the first major pillar of their research. And honestly, this is the part that completely rewired how I think about human relationships.
It's wild.
If this invisible generalized risk, this P factor, is shared across different disorders, how does it manifest in the wild when we choose who to partner up with?
So geneticists use the term assortative mating to describe our tendency to mate with others who resemble us more than you'd expect by sheer statistical chance.
Right, like we see it with height.
We see it with height, education levels, socioeconomic status.
And this paper proves it happens with mental disorders, too.
Yes, and on a massive population-wide scale.
They pulled nationwide hospital records from Denmark, analyzing nearly 500,000 couples over decades.
500,000 couples.
Now, if the risks are shared, my logical assumption is that people just partner up with someone who has the exact same diagnosis. Like, depression seeks depression, anxiety seeks anxiety.
You would think so, and I mean, there is some of that, but the data shows something much wilder. The mating is wildly transdiagnostic.
Transdiagnostic again.
Yeah. A person with any mental disorder is highly likely to partner with someone who has a completely different disorder.
Just to ground this for you listening, when we say different disorders, we're talking about entirely different categories of human behavior.
Right.
So someone with a mood disorder pairing up with someone who has an externalizing disorder, like severe substance abuse.
Or a thought disorder like schizophrenia.
Right. So they are totally mixing and matching.
Across pairwise combinations of practically every mental health condition, cross-disorder assortative mating is ubiquitous.
I have to push back here for a second, though.
Yeah.
Because when I first read that, my immediate thought was about proximity.
Okay, how so?
Wait, is this just happening because people with severe illnesses might meet in treatment centers or hospitals?
Ah, I see.
Because if you're both living in the same residential facility, your dating pool is obviously going to skew toward other people with severe conditions, regardless of what their specific label is.
The researchers anticipated that exact skepticism, which is why they didn't rely solely on the Danish hospital data.
Oh, because hospital data only shows the extremes.
Right. Hospital data inherently captures the most severe acute cases. So to test your theory, they pulled nationwide primary care records from Norway, covering over 800,000 couples.
Wow, even more.
And primary care data captures the mild to moderate conditions, the everyday struggles you see a general practitioner for, not a specialized psychiatric ward.
So they looked at the people who are just living their normal lives, going to work, getting a prescription from their family doctor.
And the Norwegian data proved that this widespread cross-disorder mating happens long before any severe hospitalizations occur. It happens across the entire spectrum of mental health. Actual couples out in the real world are vastly more concordant for diverse mental disorders than two people paired at random.
But why? I mean, why would someone dealing with profound internalizing depression unconsciously gravitate towards someone exhibiting outward externalizing substance abuse?
It comes back to that underlying P factor.
The shared grid.
Exactly. Even if the surface level symptoms look completely different, one person turns inward, the other acts outward, the underlying generalized vulnerability creates a recognizable rhythm between two people.
That is so interesting.
They might share similar emotional dysregulation, similar sensitivities to stress, or just similar ways of processing the world. They recognize the shared grid, even if their specific power surges look different.
So we are actively, unconsciously seeking out partners who share this generalized, invisible vulnerability. Here's where it gets really interesting. What happens when those two tangled genetic threads combine to create a new human?
The kids.
Right. The researchers looked at 3 generations, grandparents to parents and parents to children.
And the intergenerational transmission mirrors the mating patterns.
Meaning it's totally transdiagnostic.
Yes. A parent with a specific mental disorder doesn't exclusively have offspring with that exact same disorder. They have offspring who are at elevated risk for a whole constellation of different disorders.
There was a statistic in the paper that really crystallized this for me. Offspring who had a mood disorder had a 21% chance of having a parent who was treated for a neurotic disorder, like anxiety.
Right.
And a 10% chance of having a parent with a substance use disorder.
That data crosses all the traditional boundaries we've built. Internalizing disorders, where the distress is directed inward, like depression or anxiety, bleed into externalizing disorders, where the distress is directed outward, like aggression or addiction.
And into thought disorders, too.
Exactly, which involve a detachment from reality. The categories just dissolve across generations.
If you're looking at your own family tree, you might think, well, my mom had severe anxiety, so I only need to watch out for anxiety in myself or my kids.
Which is how we usually think about it.
Right. But actually, it's like inheriting a garden that's highly susceptible to weeds. You know something will grow because the soil is vulnerable, but you can't easily predict exactly which weeds will sprout.
The garden analogy perfectly captures why clinical prediction has frustrated doctors for decades. You inherit the general liability, the P factor, the susceptibility of the soil,
Soil, yeah.
but the specific manifestation, the specific weed that sprouts, is heavily influenced by a complex interplay of life events, environmental timing, and just random chance.
Okay, so we've established that risk is a shared pool across different disorders. We choose partners who share this broad risk pool, and we pass a generalized liability down to our kids.
Right.
But what happens if we zoom in on a single human life over time? Does an individual stick to just one weed in their garden for their entire life?
To answer that, the research team turned to one of the most famous, rigorous, longitudinal studies in the history of psychology, the Dunedin study in New Zealand.
The Dunedin study is essentially the gold standard for tracking human development, isn't it?
It absolutely is. They tracked 1,037 people from birth, all born in 1972 or 1973, all the way to age 45.
That is dedication.
And they didn't just scrape medical records. They conducted rigorous, in-person clinical interviews with these individuals 9 different times across their lives.
9 times?
Yes, and they captured the data regardless of whether the person ever officially sought treatment from a doctor.
Okay, so what does a 45-year continuous movie of human mental health actually look like?
It reveals a phenomenon called sequential comorbidity.
Sequential comorbidity.
Right. Across the lifespan, individuals rarely have just one disorder that stays perfectly static. They shift.
Like they move from one to another.
Exactly. They move between internalizing disorders, externalizing disorders, and thought disorders. By the time the participants were 45, the researchers mapped out 692 different mental disorder life history patterns.
Wait, out of 1,037 people?
Yes. 87.4% of those participants had a mental disorder life history pattern that was entirely unique to them.
Almost 90% had a completely unique path.
Unique to them, yeah.
I have to play devil's advocate here, though.
Go for it.
Over a 45-year period, the diagnostic manual, the DSM, went through massive revisions.
Oh, it certainly did.
The criteria for what constitutes depression or anxiety in 1980 was very different from the criteria in 2018. So are these individuals actually morphing, or did the psychiatric rulebook just change the goalposts on them?
That's a great question, but the Dunedin researchers controlled for that.
Oh.
By focusing on the raw symptoms the individuals reported during those intensive in-person interviews, rather than just relying on whatever the administrative billing code was at the time.
Oh, I see.
The individuals themselves were reporting radically different internal experiences and behaviors decade over decade. The morphing is real, not just an artifact of the changing manuals.
The paper used this brilliant analogy to visualize this lifespan morphing, and I really want to share it with you listening because it made the concept of sequential comorbidity click perfectly for me.
The deck of cards?
Yeah, the deck of cards. Imagine your life as a deck of cards. One card represents every year or every distinct phase of your life.
Okay.
A life with enduring mental health is basically a deck of blank cards.
Right. Totally blank.
But for someone experiencing mental illness, as they age, successive cards fill up with different colored symbols.
With the colors representing those broad families of disorders we talked about, externalizing, internalizing thought disorders.
Exactly. So maybe at age 15, your card has a blue symbol for anxiety. You're struggling with internalizing symptoms.
Yeah.
But at age 26, maybe you don't meet the criteria for anxiety anymore. Now there's a purple symbol for substance abuse on your card. The distress has externalized.
It morphed.
Right. But here is the crucial part of the analogy. The watermarks of your past disorders remain on your cards.
Yes.
Even as new, completely different disorders appear, your life history still holds the deep imprint of the old ones.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it exposes a fatal flaw in how modern medical science designs its studies. Think about the classic case control study.
Okay, that's where you take your group of people with the cases, and compare them to a healthy group, the controls.
Right.
It's the absolute bedrock of how we test drugs and look for biomarkers.
But imagine you design a case control study on depression today. You gather your depressed cases and your healthy controls. Because you are only looking at today's card in their deck, you are completely blind to the fact that 10 years ago, that currently depressed person might have had a severe conduct disorder.
Oh, wow. And your healthy control, who has a blank card today, might develop severe PTSD or substance abuse next year.
Exactly. If you just sample people based on their current card, Your data is hopelessly contaminated by the ghosts of their past and the seeds of their future.
That completely skews the data.
You aren't finding the specific biological cause of depression. You are capturing a highly biased, temporary segment of a much larger developmental trajectory. The researchers actually ran simulations on their own Dunedin data to prove this.
What did they find?
They found that if you took a group of depressed cases and simply resampled them a few years later, huge portions of them would either be classified as healthy controls or be diagnosed with an...
And if our research models had been chasing ghosts, and if this general P factor is driving everything from who we marry to what our kids inherit, so what does this all mean? How does this fundamentally change things for someone sitting in a therapist's office today, or for the doctors trying to treat them?
It means we have to radically overhaul our clinical approach.
Radically.
The researchers argue that we must abandon point-in-time single disorder measurements. If you are a clinician, you cannot afford to just treat the presenting symptom on today's card. You have to assess life course parameters.
But practically speaking, how does a doctor do that in a 45-minute intake session?
It's hard, but they need to focus on the architecture of the timeline.
Yeah.
What was the age of onset? When did the very first symbol of any color appear on a card?
Right.
What is the duration of the life course impairment? And crucially, what is the diversity of the symptoms over time?
Because diversity indicates that deeper vulnerability.
Exactly. An early onset combined with a high diversity of shifting symptoms over a lifespan is a much stronger indicator of a severe persistent liability, a high P factor, than just looking at whatever the specific diagnosis happens to be today.
It's treating the whole ecosystem of the garden, not just aggressively pulling the one weed that happens to be blooming right now.
This raises an important question about how clinical psychology operates, because this calls for an approach that clinical psychology rarely uses, but general medicine uses constantly, which is clinical staging.
Like with cancer. Stage 1, Stage 2, Stage 3.
You define where the disease sits on a continuum of progression, from a mild asymptomatic stage to a severe refractory stage.
And we don't do that in mental health.
No, but the researchers argue we desperately need to. We need transdiagnostic treatments that address the underlying vulnerabilities. If we know, based on the transdiagnostic data, that anxiety today often morphs into substance abuse tomorrow, we shouldn't just be prescribing an anti-anxiety protocol.
Because that's just treating the current card.
Right. We should be treating the generalized liability, the P factor, to intercept and prevent the progression to the next stage.
The paper also leans heavily into something called intergenerational psychiatry, which it feels incredibly daunting but necessary.
Taking thorough multi-generational family histories is vital. A person's family history doesn't just predict their risk for developing a specific disorder. It predicts the severity and the course of their lifelong mental health.
Because it tells you how deep the P factor runs in their genetic and environmental soil.
Exactly. But our current history-taking tools in standard psychiatry are inadequate, and frankly, most clinicians are not given the time or the training to sit down and map out 3 generations of transdiagnostic risk.
But the data is screaming that we can't afford not to.
We really can't.
If we keep studying and treating mental disorders one at a time as disembodied, disconnected conditions, we are fundamentally misrepresenting the lived realities of patients and their families. We have covered massive ground today.
We really have.
We started by debunking the myth that mental illnesses have single specific causes, realizing that we've been looking for a broken wire when we should have been studying the power grid.
Yeah.
We looked at the Danish and Norwegian data, revealing that we unconsciously choose partners with overlapping transdiagnostic risks. We saw how those broad risks are passed down to the next generation, creating family trees that don't just repeat one illness, but bloom with completely unpredictable variations.
And we followed the Dunedin study to see how our own personal mental health morphs and changes over our lifespans, accumulating watermarks on our deck of cards and proving that our symptoms are in constant motion.
It is a staggering amount of information to process. But I think it is ultimately incredibly validating for anyone who has ever felt like their diagnosis didn't quite capture their whole story. Or for anyone who has felt frustrated when their symptoms changed and they had to start over with a new label. Which leaves me with a final thought I want you listening to mull over. We started this deep dive talking about that comforting, clean X-ray, the deep human desire to have a single, permanent label that explains exactly what is wrong and exactly how to fix it.
It's what everyone wants.
It is. But if our mental health actually changes colors and shapes throughout our lives, wait, no, I shouldn't say it like that. if it shares deep, invisible roots with completely different struggles that we might otherwise judge or misunderstand, maybe we should stop defining ourselves by a single diagnostic label at a single point in time.
That's a powerful shift.
If we view mental health as a lifelong, evolving ecosystem rather than a rigid, permanent identity on an X-ray, how might that change the grace and patience we give to ourselves and to the people we love?
Taking a step back to view the whole lifespan, that changes everything.
Thanks for diving deep with us today. We'll see you next time.